On the same issue, we're now joined from Jerusalem by Avi Melamed, who's the founder and CEO of Inside the Middle East Intelligence Perspectives. Mr. Melamed, thank you very much for being with us. So this is the main question. This is we saw this attack this morning, the attack in Jerusalem on Saturday, 2 previous attacks in Jerusalem and another one in Jaffa. All this happening in what, less than 2 weeks? 5 different attacks. Are we inside a new terror wave?
Hi, thank you for having me. No, the answer, I don't think that's the right definition. I wouldn't use the term wave, because we have to remember that we have been basically on a constant situation in a lulls of calmness, and then once again you got this individual-driven terror attack. So I wouldn't rush to use the term wave. Obviously, it's clear that some major Palestinian factors like Hamas or Islamic Jihad would have a lot of interest in seeing something that is more wavy style, but I don't think that this is the situation currently. Again, we are witnessing what we call an individual-driven terror attack, and it may continue.
Avi, you're staying with us for another issue, please, and that is an interesting thing happening at the Persian Gulf. The United Arab Emirates top national security advisor, Sheikh Tahnoun bin Zayed Al Nahyan, is on a visit to Iran to discuss expanding bilateral ties with the Islamic Republic. Sheikh Tahnoun is also the brother of the UAE leader, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed. Last month, the diplomatic advisor of the UAE president said the Emirates hope to take steps aimed at de-escalation with Iran as part of a policy choice towards diplomacy and away from confrontation. So, Avi Melamed, the question is the UAE, what kind of game, let's call it, they're playing? On the one hand, the Abraham Accords, very good relations with Israel. On the other hand, we're seeing getting closer to Iran.
Yes, that's the game of the region. That's the way countries are dealing with their neighbors and conduct their foreign policy. UAE is a very significant player in the Middle East, very important one. And UAE more and more is taking a frontline leadership. Just reminding you that a couple of days ago, the UAE heir was visiting formally Turkey, and he was very warmly accepted. UAE is going to massively invest in Turkey. UAE is seeking all the time to have a better relationship with its neighbor, that it's called Iran. The UAE have no illusion about the nature of the regime in Iran, but the UAE understand this is their neighbor and they have to find ways to dwell one next to the other, reminding you that Iran presents a security challenge to the United Arab Emirates. There is also a lot of controversial issues between the two, like, for example, 3 islands that are occupied by the Iranians that the UAE argue it belongs to the UAE. But the interesting thing about it is to see that the UAE, they are very smart. They are coming to these discussions with the Iranian from a point of power. Because they have been kind of like able, the UAEs, to establish their position as a powerful factor in the region. Just a very significant note and a very interesting hint or signal from the UAE to Iran. The same day that the UAE basically, today is the visit, but yesterday, the UAE sent a formal invitation to the president of Israel to come and visit the UAE. This is a very clear signal to the Iranians. And the UAE basically are very significant on the other hand, to the Iranians, because the UAE today is, for example, one of the Arab countries, and it's important one, that is kind of like pushing forwards to take back Assad regime into the Arab world. UAE can play a very significant role as far as the Iranians concerned in the context of the situation in Lebanon. So you could see there is a mutual point of meeting, sort of speaking, between the interests of the two, the UAE and the Iranians. But the interesting thing to see is that the UAE very wisely are coming to this discussion from a point of a strength, not from a point of a weakness. That's not exactly the situation when you look today at the Iranians.
So you're saying the UAE is coming to in a position of strength towards Iran, and yet how is this perhaps viewed in Israel? How much concern is there perhaps from the fact that Israel's new best friend is actually getting closer to Iran?
In the Middle East, you don't have best friends and you don't have bitter enemies. It varies. Look, it's very significant, the relationship that Israel has with the UAE. I anticipate those relationships to continue and further strengthen. The UAE have no illusions about the Iranian regime. And they definitely are not going to drop the Israeli card just because the Iranian regime is smiling at them. So from an Israeli perspective, all along I can see mostly a benefit in the sense that the UAE kind of like can be a sort of like a go-between or send messages or provide some kind of like messages that could be also in the service of the state of Israel. We have to remember, but at the same time, that while we are working quite closely with the UAE and particularly in the area of technologies and security and intelligence capacities, we have to be aware also in the back of our minds to that point. But all in all, when I look at the picture, I think that Israel should not be concerned with the discussions going on between the EU and the Iranians. We have to remember, in the end of the day, they are going nowhere. Iran is going to be there. Iran is a very significant player. UAE is a very significant player. They have interest. Israel has to make sure that its own strategic interest will not be compromised by that.
Very interesting points there coming from this meeting in Tehran. Avi Melamed, founder and CEO of Inside the Middle East Intelligence Perspectives. Thank you very much for being with us.
My pleasure.
We're now taking